Professor Ethan Grayson was a man obsessed with the past. For years, he had pored over ancient texts, studied long-forgotten languages, and reconstructed the history of civilizations long gone. But it wasn't enough. His real ambition, his true dream, was to visit the past, to see it with his own eyes. After decades of work, he had finally achieved what many thought impossible: a time machine. It stood in the center of his laboratory, a sleek, metallic device with glowing blue energy pulsing around its core. It wasn't much to look at, but Ethan didn't care about appearances. It was what the machine could do that mattered. He had spent years planning this moment, making sure every detail was correct. His calculations were flawless, his preparations meticulous. But what Ethan didn't know was that one tiny error, one small oversight, would change everything. The day had arrived. Ethan stood in front of the time machine, his heart pounding with excitement. He had chosen his destination carefully: ancient Egypt, the time of the great pharaohs. He had always been fascinated by the pyramids, the tombs, and the mysteries that surrounded them. Now he would see it all firsthand. With a deep breath, Ethan stepped into the machine, his hands trembling as he adjusted the controls. The coordinates were set, and the machine hummed with energy. He closed his eyes and pressed the button. There was a blinding flash of light, and for a moment, Ethan felt like he was floating, weightless, surrounded by the hum of time itself. Then, with a jolt, he landed. He opened his eyes, expecting to see the golden sands of Egypt, the towering pyramids, the Nile River flowing in the distance. But what he saw was not what he expected. Ethan found himself in a dense jungle, the air thick with humidity and the sound of strange creatures calling in the distance. He blinked in confusion, his mind racing. This wasn't Egypt. This wasn't even close. He stepped out of the machine, looking around frantically. The trees were massive, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches reaching high into the sky. Vines hung down like curtains, and the ground was covered in thick undergrowth. Panic began to rise in Ethan's chest. How could this have happened? His calculations had been perfect. He should have arrived in Egypt, not wherever this was. He checked the machine's coordinates, his hands shaking. That's when he saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible mistake in the coding. A single digit was off, sending him not to ancient Egypt, but to a time far, far earlier. Ethan's heart sank as he realized where he was. He hadn't traveled to the age of the pharaohs. He had traveled millions of years into the past, back to the age of the dinosaurs. For a moment, Ethan stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the enormity of his mistake. He had wanted to visit the past, but not this far back. This was a time before civilization, before humanity, before anything he knew. He had to get back to the machine. He had to fix the coordinates and return to his own time. But just as he turned to head back to the machine, he heard a low, rumbling growl behind him. Slowly, Ethan turned around, his breath catching in his throat. Standing not far away was a creature he had only ever seen in books: a Tyrannosaurus Rex. Its massive body towered over him, its sharp teeth glistening in the sunlight as it let out a deafening roar. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. He had to move now. Without thinking, Ethan bolted for the machine, his legs pumping as fast as they could carry him. The ground shook beneath him as the T-Rex gave chase, its heavy footsteps thundering through the jungle. Ethan could feel the dinosaur's hot breath on his back as he raced toward the time machine, his mind screaming in terror. He reached the machine just as the T-Rex lunged for him, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from his body. Ethan dove into the machine, slamming the door behind him. His hands fumbled with the controls, his heart racing. He had to fix the coordinates, but his mind was clouded with fear. The T-Rex slammed its head against the machine, causing the entire structure to shake. "Come on, come on," Ethan muttered, his fingers flying over the controls. He recalibrated the machine, hoping to return to his own time. The T-Rex roared again, its massive teeth scraping against the machine's metal exterior. Ethan pressed the button, and once again, the machine was engulfed in a blinding flash of light. When Ethan opened his eyes, he was no longer in the jungle. The air was cooler, the ground solid beneath his feet. He let out a breath of relief, convinced that he had made it back to his own time. But as he stepped out of the machine, he quickly realized something was wrong. The world around him was unfamiliar. The buildings were strange, their architecture unlike anything he had ever seen. People moved about in strange vehicles, their clothes futuristic and unfamiliar. Tall skyscrapers towered above him, and the sky was filled with drones and flying machines. Ethan's heart sank. He hadn't returned to his own time. In his panic, he had overshot his destination, landing not in the present, but in the far future. The people in this new world stared at him with curiosity, whispering among themselves as they passed by. Ethan looked around, his mind racing. This was a world of advanced technology, a world far beyond anything he had ever imagined. But it wasn't his world. He had made a mistake, a terrible mistake. Ethan quickly ducked back into the time machine, his hands shaking as he recalibrated the coordinates once more. He had to get back to his own time, back to the safety of his laboratory. But as he adjusted the controls, a sinking feeling settled in his chest. He had tampered with time too much. He had lost control of his machine. Ethan pressed the button. The machine hummed to life, and once again, he was engulfed in a flash of light. This time, when Ethan opened his eyes, he found himself in a vast, empty desert. There were no buildings, no people, no signs of life. Just endless sand stretching out in every direction. He stepped out of the machine, his heart pounding. Had he gone back to the past? Or was he in some distant, desolate future? He didn't know. And for the first time in his life, Professor Ethan Grayson, the man who had always been in control, realized that he was lost. Lost in time,